Has anyone ever asked you who you are most like, your mom or your dad? It's actually pretty fun to talk about. I happen to be more like my dad in the way I look and more like my mom in some of the ways that I think and behave. But the really interesting question is why? Why are these differences and similarities there? The answer to that question actually shapes a great deal of the way we spend our lives. These similarities and differences are actually in our genes, and our genes are on our DNA, and our DNA is on the chromosomes that we get from our parents. DNA is a molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's a polymer, a big molecule that's made out of little molecules called monomers. Now that's really misleading because it assumes that these molecules are really big, when in reality they are actually super tiny. Most people know a little bit about DNA. They know that it has something to do with genes and so forth, but they don't really know about its structure and about the way in which it actually functions. Because although, yes, it does give you your traits, that's not really what it does. So we're going to learn about the scientific structure and function of DNA. So we have two functions of DNA. The first is that it stores information. Now, the information is actually what we're referring to when we talk about genes. Genes are the information, and their job is to actually make proteins. The proteins are what are actually going to be our traits. So for instance, I have dimples, which I got from my dad because my dad gave me the DNA that carries the genes that make the small stringy muscles that pull back on my cheek and give me a dimple. Now, part of the reason why my dad could give me those genes is because of the second job of DNA, which is that DNA can replicate or actually make a copy of itself that it can then use to pass on to offspring. Because it's so important, most cells protect their DNA in a special compartment called a nucleus. We can see a nucleus in animal cells and plant cells, and there are a few cells that don't have a nucleus where the DNA just floats around freely in the cytoplasm. DNA is also protected by its special shape. This is the shape that we're accustomed to seeing when we see DNA, where it's like a twisted ladder. This is called a double helix. A double helix means that there are two chains, one chain here and one chain here, that are made up of smaller units that repeat themselves, which we can see pretty easily. So I think the easiest way to understand DNA is to actually draw and build one. So that's what we're going to do right now. Now we're going to start out by using its small units, and its small units or monomers are called nucleotides. So nucleotides are the small units. So you want to write this in your notes the same way I am. A nucleotide is actually made up of three parts. The first part is a sugar, and it looks like a pentagon like this, and its name is deoxyribose. On that sugar, kind of going up on the side, is something called a phosphate. So this is a phosphate, and this is our sugar. The third part of the nucleotide is the part that actually is the most important because it's where the information is stored. It's called a nitrogen base and sticks out towards the center of the DNA molecule. And I'm going to give it a particular shape. So in this case, it's going to be pointed. Now there are four different shapes, four different bases that are used in DNA to be the code. And there are four letters that go along with them. The first one is A. That's for a molecule called adenine. And I'm going to label this molecule with an A. This is one nucleotide, but DNA is actually made up of many nucleotides. They attach to one another in a chain. So here's my sugar, and here is my phosphate again, And they are going to be attached to one another with a bond called a covalent bond, which is very strong and is not going to break. It is also attached to another nitrogen base. Now this nitrogen base, you'll notice, has a different shape. I'm going to call this one G. G stands for guanine. And it has a different shape because it also has a different chemical structure. My next nucleotide is going to go directly under the two that I've just drawn and is going to be attached between the phosphate and the sugar, and will have another base. This is my third base. It is T. T stands for thymine. My next nucleotide will go directly under that one. There's a bond between the phosphate and the sugar, and my fourth nitrogen base will be a C, and C stands for cytosine. DNA is actually a very long chain, so I'm going to put one more nucleotide here in place, and I am going to pick a base to put there. I'm going to happen to put T, which is for thymine, but this chain would continue on. This entire side of the molecule is referred to as a strand. Now remember that DNA is a double helix and we're only showing one strand. So attached to the other side is going to be our second strand. Our second strand is going to have a base that is going to fit with the base that's already on the strand that we have here. And you can see that the shapes fit together. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and put in the other nucleotides that would go in place with the 4 bases that are remaining. So we now have 2 strands, and between our 2 bases, we have what is known as complementary fit. Complementary fit means that they fit together like puzzle pieces. This entire molecule is held together by bonds. The bonds that we see here between the parts of our strand that are in black, these are very strong bonds called covalent bonds. Covalent bonds don't break very easily. They are very strong and they're going to hold the strand together. However, the parts that are in between our bases, between our colored pieces, these are very weak bases. They are hydrogen bonds, and hydrogen bonds are able to pull apart and go back together very easily. Because this colored section that we have in the center, this is our code. And right now, the code is hidden away, tucked down the inside. But when we need it, we can open up those weak hydrogen bonds, and the code will be available for us to use to make the proteins that will be our traits. DNA is made of nucleotides, made of phosphate, sugars, and nitrogen bases. Nucleotides are linked by covalent bonds, a type of bond that is very strong. The bases in the middle are held together by hydrogen bonds, which are weak bonds. This allows us to open them up and get to the code inside the DNA. So now you know this is what DNA is and why it can do the terrific things that it does.